Hello and welcome to episode 69 of the Adoption and Fostering Podcast with me, Scott Casson, Renee and Im.
Al Coates.
Jazz hands.
Jazz hands. It's the summertime edition, and so this week we're not going to do much of an intro because
we're bored.
No, we're not bored. Speak for yourself.
Because we're going on our hollybobs, aren't we?
Yeah,
well, kind of. We're not. Well, kind of.
So this will be airing. It'll be late August. The weather will be fine. Brexit will be fixed. The rain will have gone away, and we'll have had beautiful sunshine for weeks and weeks and weeks. And where will you be, Scott?
I'll be abroad. That's where I'll be.
You are permanently abroad. Excellent.
I shall be in the Middle East.
Excellent.
In plus 50 degrees, probably quite red, I would imagine. I'll have an evening out with camels and things like that. I can't say the country because it's illegal for me to go there.
Oh, what is some sort of international order against you personally?
Yeah, against me personally. Yeah.
I understand that.
No,
I think you've said enough.
As a couple, we shouldn't really be going to this place, but we do, and we don't have many problems. So we keep going back. A lot of people don't like the fact that we do that, but anyway, we do. What are you doing, Al? What's happening with you? What's current? What's happening?
Do you know what? I've got 2 weeks off, and I've not had 2 weeks off. I can't remember the last time I took 2 weeks off, and
Blimey.
Wendy's insisted I had it, and my other boss, and so no one's going to contact me for 2 whole weeks, and.
Oh my God, you're going to go stir crazy.
I'm going to be. There's going to be hell on Twitter, I tell you. Absolute hell.
What do you mean there is going to be?
No, I'm going to really kick off. After about 6 hours of just me in the house, I'll be foaming at the mouth. No, I've got 2 aspirations so far. One is to go and see the Angel of the North with Peanut because she wants to go and touch the Angel of the North.
Oh yeah, good idea.
And the and the second one is to go and see. There's a silver spoon in the town I live, Cramlington.
Yeah, you told me about this. Yeah, go on.
12-foot spoon stuck in the earth, and it says "Dig for England." So we're going to go and see that. That's all she wants to do. So we're going to do that.
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm.
So that's the first morning cracked off. But anyway,
I was going to say that's going to take all of 3 hours.
Yeah, cracked off. I'm sure the good Mrs. C's got plans for me.
I'm sure she has. And you've got to top up your wood for the winter, so you know.
Excellent. I do have some chopping to do. Anyway, right, well, earlier in the summer, actually, it was quite a while ago, it was in July, we spoke to Brigid Featherstone, and actually...
We did.
And it all sort of came out of a moment on Twitter where we were discussing... Surprise. We were discussing, actually, where can we have these conversations, because 160 characters, or whatever, it's 280, isn't it, 260? 100 is just not enough to actually get away with it. And she'd written a paper, and it's called... On Hope, Loss, Anger, and the Spaces in Between, Reflections on Living with and in Adoption and the Role of the Social Worker, which is a mouthful. And that's been published in Child and Family Social Work. And so if you DM Brigid Featherstone, she will give you access to that. And on the basis of that, we had a fantastic chat. And I have to say, we could have kept going because it was... We
could have done, actually. I actually quite enjoyed it.
What do you mean you actually quite enjoyed it?
No, well, it was one of those situations where it was... Because you know me, I'm no intellectual person. And nor are you, to be fair. But it was just... Yeah. The whole conversation was really, really interesting, and I actually really enjoyed it.
Yeah, and Brid was a really good. She was a cracking guest and brought out some really interesting stuff. So we're not going to do an outro, are we? Because
no, we're not, because we're going on a holiday.
Hollybobs, yeah, hollybobs, boom. Yeah. And it's actually quite a long interview, so it's worth of it in of itself. So we'll I don't know.
We'll bid you bon summer.
Yeah. Have a cracking summer. I hope it's all been good and the weather's been fine.
And we'll see you when it's raining.
Yeah, I suppose coming in the autumn, we've got some really exciting stuff. We've got Joanne Alper, we've got Sally Donovan. I thought I'd like to do an episode, a bit like we did the panel episode, an episode about confidentiality.
Ooh.
Yes, and I've got some other thoughts about different themes and topics that I thought you
we've
and I
also
should
got,
unpick.
well, we should, yes, always unpicking everything. We've also got lots of adoptee conversations, and we've actually got some really alternative conversations as well. And I think we should hashtag that right now. Hashtag alt convos. Okay, so we've got a birth child who has been brought up being part of a foster care family. That's why I'm saying hashtag alt convos, because how can you define that within 3 words? You can. And then we've got someone who actually is a little bit older, who was taken into care as a 15, 16-year-old. We've got that conversation coming up as well. So that's all in the autumn. That's some really interesting ones
Wonderful
coming up,
ones,
actually.
And Helen Bonnick and lots of people wanting to come on the podcast.
Yeah.
I've also got I'm hoping to have an adopter adoptee whose parent was an adopter and whose son is an adoptee as well.
That is so cryptic. It is untrue.
3 generations of adoptees through a family.
You're going to have to put a little planogram thing together for me.
I will. I'll draw you a picture and send it to you.
Yeah, do. Yeah,
Thank you. Yeah. Excellent.
Put it in a pop-up book. I'll read it.
Boom. Flip chart.
Yeah.
Here we go. Right. Well, look after yourself, Scott, and I hope
and
you...
and have a fabulous summer, Mr. C.
And you. And remember to apply sun cream.
Okay.
Bye.
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 So today we're speaking to Professor Brigid Featherstone. And hello, Brigid. How are you?
Hi, Al. Hi, Scott. I'm well, thank you.
Excellent. And we have been in touch over several years. We kind of have these conversations, sometimes on Twitter and sometimes on email and sometimes when we bump into each other. And I think you were on one of our very first podcasts, and you are someone I think who's got a kind of an oversight view of adoption. You have this kind of slightly different view, which I think is really interesting and healthy. So we were having it. I don't know how we got into this, but we got into a Twitter conversation a few weeks ago, and then it kind of led to us inviting you back on to have a chat. So that conversation was about conversations, wasn't it? Where can we have difficult conversations or interesting conversations about adoption? So what's going on in your head about that then?
Yeah, I think what I was reflecting on with you was that there was quite a lot of chat on Twitter about adoption. I think following the Adoption UK report, actually.
Yeah.
And I think somebody may have challenged me or said, "Oh, what do you think?" And I thought, I am definitely not having this kind of very complex discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think I was also, maybe saying to you that after we had published our report, that for the first time maybe in my academic life, I'd ended up with quite a lot of criticism that I felt, oh my God, they haven't even read the report. It felt like it was a very odd time after the report was published. So I've been a bit wary about going very far on Twitter about adoption. And that contrasts with my experience during the inquiry, where we actually talked to all sorts of people in the same room. Indeed, you were one of them.
Yeah.
Do you remember we had one event in Huddersfield where we brought together birth parents, adopted people, social workers, some lawyers. Some people were very upset and angry, but we actually had a really good day together. And so I was kind of reflecting on that and feeling wistful for that process, to be honest.
That's really interesting, because I think, and you probably concur, Scott, is that one of the reasons we have the podcast is because we want to have those conversations.
Yeah.
But Twitter is a terrible place for any sort of. It's very polar, isn't it? It brings out all kinds of unpleasantness at times. So interesting what you're saying there about reflecting on those conversations, but also that you've not necessarily felt that. Had you hoped that the adoption inquiry would provoke those conversations?
Yes, and I think to some extent it has in places. I just don't think it has on Twitter, but I think that's possibly about the medium of Twitter.
Yeah.
But I think there has been a limited amount of, for example, I personally have talked to quite a lot of social workers since the inquiry finished. Anna and I have been to speak to principal social workers. I've been to adoption social workers. I've been to one adoption, for example. So we've talked to quite a lot of social workers, and we also had a launch not only in London, but we had one in Huddersfield, where loads of local social workers, particularly involved in adoption, came. So I think there have been quite a lot, and at each of our events, we always have a birth mother, an adoptive parent, and an adopted person on the panel with us. So, and the last time actually was the Swan Conference, which was really the best one, I think. We did really good conversation there with an adopted person, an adoptive parent, and a birth mother, and myself. And the room was full of social workers from different bits of social work. And that was a great discussion, really thoughtful discussion.
So what are could you give us a summary of that discussion? Because I think that would be interesting.
Well, I think the reason I really liked that one was that the adopted person in particular spoke very movingly about the possible implications for her own safety if she hadn't been adopted. She was quite clearly saying, if this hadn't happened to me, I mightn't be here today, because of the circumstances in her family. And I think that brought a level of kind of real thought into the room about, we have to be really careful about taking binary positions on any of this, and people's real safety and actual lives are at risk at times. And I think and I think the other thing is the birth mother was very thoughtful about the consequences of domestic abuse and the ways in which, because often, in the wider public, people will say, oh, well, all these kids are abused and they're taken away, they're saved. And of course, some of them are. But we do know that there are so many women losing their children because of domestic abuse, and there are real ethical issues around that. And I think so there were a whole range of things going on. And none of us were saying glibly, there is one way forward and there is one size fits all or one story about adoption. We were all saying it's really full of complexities, which is what we're trying to get out in the article as well. Yeah,
because I find the voice. Sorry, Scott, I'm asking all the questions. Yeah, no. We've got a guest, not in front of guests.
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, yes. The voices of social workers are the ones that we hear least frequently in the debate, but they're the people, they're the thinkers. They've got their hands on the machinery, haven't they? And so is there a progressive voice amongst that, or is it a kind of a traditional voice, or is it a mixed picture? So I've probably answered the question.
Yeah, no, it's very mixed. I think our message that a lot of social workers, people who engaged with the inquiry, were really worried about having to rush the work, really worried about the lack of resources generally across the piece. Because don't forget, when we did it, we were probably maybe the first people, possibly, I don't know, to look at the broader policy picture at the time, that we were losing children's centres, we were losing universal credit was being sent out, etc. And we were putting together bits of a jigsaw that maybe hadn't necessarily been put together. And so social workers, I think, were saying, we are really worried that this is a very consequential piece of work, probably one of the biggest decisions you can make as a social worker. And, we're not doing it in the best of circumstances. We're not having the resources. The other thing I think social workers worry about a lot is the fragmentation of their role. That the person who maybe has taken the child and gone through care proceedings and has known the birth family is not the person who ends up often being involved at the stage of the matching or even, at the approval. And with regionalisation, actually, I think that fragmentation has got worse.
Right.
Because I mean, and look, I'm not harking back to the old days, and there were loads of problems in the past. But often the social worker would do the whole thing, or they would know the other social workers involved. They would just sit down the corridor from them and they would talk to them. Whereas social workers become very fragmented as a profession. I can be working with 0 to 5s, then I pass the case on to somebody else, and there are all these specialisms, and now they're very geographically different from each other. So adoption social workers are miles away from child protection social workers, literally, physically, geographically.
Because in some ways, when you started the inquiry 2016, the region
around that time,
the regionalisation agenda was just an agenda, and now we're in a position where that's almost come to its fruition fully. So that must have had an impact on social workers' thoughts and feelings.
Yeah, it was bubbling away in the inquiry, and a couple of people said to us, and we're worried about regionalisation. But it's since then, since we did the inquiry, when we go and talk to people, they talk more about regionalisation now than they did. Yeah. Clearly, yeah. And we've been talking to some of the regional agencies actually.
Mm-hmm. I've read through the article that's going to be available in Children and Family Social Work, and it's brought out some different aspects of the inquiry itself. It's unfortunate that isn't going to be. Is that going to be made available for general release, or is that going to sort of remain behind the paywall?
I am really happy to make it available, and I also. I think there's a time restriction, but both Anna and I have university repositories where it's easy to get hold of things. Right. But that might be a time restriction. But Anna and I will send copies out to people. Of course we will. Yeah, we know that these things are kind of problematic in terms of the paywall and access. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that would be great, because I think it's really interesting, and I read through it and picked out a few points that I thought if you could sort of maybe elaborate on them. One of them was this idea of for families, thinking about adopters, this idea of seeking help in the shadow of risk. There was a really potent little phrase that, and what does that mean for families? What are you kind of meaning? Unpack that for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and again, actually, this came up again yesterday in another podcast I was doing about working with affluent families and working with poor families. One of the things that happens whatever your situation, once you go into the child protection system, actually, it is still, unfortunately, I mean, there's a lot of things trying to be changed about it, and there's a lot of innovation and good practice happening, but it is still a very risk-averse situation, and there is a lot of kind of mother blaming. I mean, sometimes it's parent blaming, but often it's mother blaming. So when you go in and ask for help, whether you're a birth parent or an adoptive parent, unfortunately, your story is often taken away from you and turned into a story of your risk or your inability to meet your child's needs, because it's quite an individualised project, the child protection system. It's about working out what you are doing or not doing. Well, you know yourself from the child to parent violence stuff that a lot of parents receive quite a blaming approach, or can do.
And do you think, well, I sometimes think that's perhaps it's a paradigm that children's services are focused on children, which is also alluded to in the report, well, it's spoken specifically about, but that actually when children are then pulled out of that, then it's seen to protect children. It's focused on protection children, which is right. But then sometimes children are part of this complicated mix, this complicated dynamic. I'm thinking specifically of challenging violent aggressive behaviour. And so is that something that a lot of people are talking about to you in relation to adoption?
Are they talking to me a lot about that? Adoptive parents are talking to me a lot about that. I mean, in my own personal life, I know quite a lot of adoptive parents, and I know the struggles they go through with trying to get help for children. And adoptive, I think social workers are starting to realise more generally that the child protection system is quite a blaming system, and that it is, especially when resources are tight. And there are loads of reasons for it, as you know, because social workers get blamed themselves all the time when things go wrong. So they're pretty risk averse, and it's changing, and there's a lot of work being done to try and change it, in particular local authorities. But a lot of the time, their paradigm is that if there's something wrong with the child, it must be something you're doing or not doing. As a parent, they don't look at the context of like, well, how are you coping? What's going on for you? What else is happening in your life? I mean, unfortunately, over the decades, we've become not very inhumane about parents at times. And this phrase, which we talk a lot in the book, in the article, this has occurred time and time again in our work. And in fact, the Transparency Review, I'm nearly sure, have also done a blog on this. I'm only here for the child. That's a phrase workers say to families, and it is so unhelpful to parents to hear that, whether they're birth parents or adoptive parents, because they are made to feel invalid. And a nonsense, because it's not respecting the child's identity, which is as a part of a network of relationships. The child doesn't see themselves as an individual.
It's a complicated dynamic, and I have seen it, and if I'm honest, I've experienced it as well. Is that it's no malice necessarily. It's just it's a reframing, and if I dare I say, a lack of education in relation to parenting and the impact of complicated family dynamics. That lack of awareness of what that looks like, and the impact of that on a child, and the impact of that on parents and siblings and the wider family. Scott, come on, give me
Give me some.
I know you've got some questions as well.
No, I was just thinking in terms of the information that's given to adopters when they're being matched with children, because I've actually seen it a lot recently, and I've just experienced it personally myself. The lack of information that's given. And what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that came up. There was a whole section of the report where we talk about the similarities between the birth parents' accounts and the adoptive parents' accounts of the relationship with the workers. And both of them used words like lie, which is quite shocking. They both used words like the social worker said lied to them. But more commonly, they used words like we weren't given all the information. Now, I don't know what you think about this. I'd be really interested in both your views on this. We both wondered, though, with both birth parents and adoptive parents, whether, because it's so emotional, we wondered sometimes whether with both lots they were able to hear what was being told. Now, we're not just colluding with social workers here, but we are just saying, when you are desperate to kind of to believe something, i.e. that you're going to be able to keep your child, which is what used to happen, or as an adoptive parent, if you're desperate to have that child, that maybe you can screen out. We all do it, don't we? We screen out things that are comfortable for us. However, it did come up a lot, and that's why we talk a lot in around ethical trespass about being as honest as possible with people and really being open and straightforward with people. I mean, I know from other research I've done and from years and years of teaching students that there is so much evidence from service users generally about the fact that they can really respect people who are honest with them, even if the outcome was terrible. That social workers will say, or families will say, my child was taken, but the social worker told me the truth and was honest and fair with me. The process was fair. That's a very long answer. Sorry.
No, you're fine. I think as well, there's a kind of lack of confidence, isn't there, to ask questions or to kind of drill down on maybe bits of information that maybe in are they still called CPRs? It's been so long since I had a child.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Child protection reports.
I thought it was a child placement report.
Well, we'll find out.
Anyway, yeah, no doubt people will write in.
Perhaps the professor should know, but will not embarrass a CPR child.
But interest. And the reason I'm kind of going a bit further with this one is because I was clearing out drawers last weekend, as you do, and I came over the 14-year-old CPRs, and what didn't seem relevant then seems relevant now, because it addresses some of the things, because you go back to things, don't you, and you reflect on them and stuff. So it's just, I think for parents it's about that confidence, in the same way that we trust in the professionals that are advising us at the time. So thinking about contact, thinking about kind of issues with potential medical issues and all that sort of stuff. So I think from an adopter's perspective, I can't talk for the birth families or the birth parents, sadly, but from an adopter's perspective, some of it is about confidence and also the relevance of that information, because some of it you're not going to know until 5 years down the line.
Yeah. Absolutely. And that's true in life, isn't it? That, something will happen with your child at school that it's only a couple of years later you'll think, that was really important, but I didn't recognise that at the time. Yeah. I mean, and also, look, it's like every process, isn't it? There's a lot of anxiety going on both sides, a lot of people wanting to kind of perform. I'm a foster parent. I've been assessed as a foster parent, the whole idea of assessment and, kind of how you tell your story, how you hear their story. And that's why the whole thing about time is so important. We know that delay is bad for children, but we really, really we should try to do this job very carefully and thoughtfully, and we shouldn't be rushing. That's why we don't have them now, but people were really worried about things like targets generally and all that kind of rushing of assessments, etc.
Yeah, I do think that there's reflecting back on the whole little bit that I've probably like you, Scott. I've sat in preparation. So I've been asked to share something like adoption preparation, and I can see that some people are not wanting to hear bad news. They've got this kind of this rule of optimism of this will not happen to me. This is different for me. I don't believe you, and I think that transfers through to CPRs that. We've all gone to the shops and wanted to buy something to discover it's gone and accepted something that wasn't. That's a terrible analogy, but that
is a very bad analogy.
But it's true. It's that sense of I came here to get this, that's not here. Well, that will do because I've got this far down the process. I've invested this much. This might be my only chance. So then there's that maybe bit of self kind of deceit. There's a whole raft of stuff that I think that we talk to. I guess we get a spectrum of adopters, don't we? We get new adopters, older adopters, and some long in the tooth adopters. And the long in the tooth adopters are can be very honest about themselves and what they stepped over to get children.
Yeah.
And with hindsight, they'd say, "Well, I wish I hadn't. Wish I hadn't a really complicated one." But how do you prepare people for adoption? That's a big question.
Massive. Well, we still haven't worked that one out, have we? And we're now 20 years into these processes, and we still haven't worked out the best way to do it, or the most comprehensive way to do it. So how long is a piece of string, really?
And it's very painful, isn't it? Because in my social world, I have encountered somebody who was just starting on the journey around adoption, and I just so didn't want to be this old pessimistic kind of you're just desperately not trying to be the whatever it is. What is it? What's that word? You're just kind of like gloomy, but I found it really hard because she really, really, really wanted to go down this road and has done, actually. She has done. But trying to talk to her, I mean, it was in a social situation. It wasn't in a professional situation. It's very painful stuff. It's equally very painful when people are having trouble with their children as well, and they're really struggling, and you're trying to understand what that's about as a friend and stuff. That's really painful as well. But,
Do you find that frustrating with the crossover into social work then? It must be. I can't imagine how any social worker actually who does the work that you guys do, who then has it in a personal capacity, whether it's at a distance or close up. It must be really difficult because
I don't
separate, aren't they?
I'm an academic, but
but you know what I'm saying. Just sort of kind of experience of working along this kind of route, sort of thing.
Yeah, well, I must admit, of all the pieces of work I've done, the adoption inquiry was probably the most important and interesting in many ways in terms of me, but you're certainly right, because it kind of, I mean, somebody from the BBC said the same thing to me. Of all the bits of the child protection system, adoption covers all classes, all social milieu, whereas, for the people, they would never have met someone necessarily going through a child protection investigation, but they will know somebody. She was saying that every time they do a programme on adoption, the number of people in the BBC who want to talk to them about what's happened to them or to their neighbours or their friends. So, yes, so this raised loads of questions, all sorts of levels, actually. Yeah, and crossed over all the time. And I was very worried about upsetting some of my friends who are adoptive parents. I was really worried about that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't want to draw you onto the rocks, but why not? What was the anxiety around upsetting them?
Because we were saying it's really important to hear birth parents' stories. It's really, really important to give them a voice, and they have been left out. And we were saying, look, you can't have one story about adoption. this is, and also because we were saying things like, older adopted people are telling us that they have questions for years afterwards, that they want to know things that, so it was about the fact that we were actually bringing the birth parents into the room in a way. And because I worried unnecessarily, absolutely, totally unnecessarily, I worried that would mean that we were saying what you've done is bad. I mean, there was one adoptive parent that I talked to at great length about whether I was actually saying that what they'd done was unethical, by adopting.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
It's a big question, because I think a lot of older adopters, and again, like we were saying, that older cohort of adopters have some really big questions about the ethics, especially when they've perhaps gone through the process of helping or supporting their children through reunion, and then that idea of actually meeting this birth family that are not necessarily what they were portrayed as at the beginning 20 years ago, or have changed. Because people change.
Yeah.
So a lot of people asking big questions, but back to the beginning point is we don't know where to have those conversations in a safe, appropriate, healthy manner. I was going to ask. Sorry.
Oh, go on.
No, go. No, Scott. No, you.
You go.
No, you go.
You were talking about. You said big questions there. I mean. It's a massive thing, this, isn't it? Because there's so much that you've just said there, in terms of the kind of perspective of the birth parents and how that might upset people. I think in reality we're becoming more aware of it as parents, if that makes sense. So I don't talk as an academic or a social worker. I talk as just an adoptive parent who works with adoptive parents, and I think we become so much aware of that. So do you think there's like an appetite generally for asking these big questions and for change to come out of them as well?
Well, I'd be very interested in your views on it. I feel mixed. I feel that there were lots of people who were very supportive of the fact that BASW commissioned this, that Anna and I did it, that we used words like ethics and human rights, and they were very positive about the report. I mean, the number of people who said to me afterwards, "Oh my goodness, that was quite I don't know what they were expecting, but they said it was a very calm, measured report." And I thought, well, what did you expect to say?
It's a hysterical document.
We were going to put a bomb in the whole middle of it all. I think though that there are people who are still who don't want to ask these questions, who don't want to talk about things like poverty and birth parents, who don't want to talk about things like the narrative is these birth parents have abused their children, and adoptive parents are not getting the support they need. I think that's a strand, and it's quite hard to break into that. I think there's a lot more going on though. I think one of the things that's really, really interesting is how many adopted people are talking now, aren't they? I mean, especially social media. My goodness.
My goodness, that's the nicest way I can put it.
Yeah,
it's been fraught.
Yes,
but
I think I mean, we've both mentioned this a couple of times on the podcast and when we've chatted as well, and I think that there's a lot of useful output to that conversation. There really is, but it's not for the faint-hearted. because you've just touched on that bit there about how we've got it in not we. I'm not talking. So when I say we, I'm talking about generally.
Yeah.
The majority of people have got it in their heads that this has happened and that's happened and these are bad people, because that's our perception of it. But actually, having this different kind of viewpoint now does make you think very, very, very differently about the whole situation. And I have to say that in the last kind of 6 months to a year, since I've started engaging with adoptees, I've started to parent very differently as a result of that, because I'm listening. I'm trying to take on board what they're saying, and I'm trying to do things in a different way because of that. And we have to add that voice into whatever it is that the future holds for permanence, let's say, rather than just focusing on adoption, because that's just the big thing at the minute, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, isn't it a supreme irony that in social work we always talked about listening to the voice of the child, but one of the things that came out of the adoption inquiry, it was that we weren't listening. We weren't even asking children that they want to be adopted.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe we wouldn't have been able to, I don't know, but certainly when you think about it, the voice of the child seemed to be absent in adoption. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think that, that blog that came out this week about loving and love and loss.
Yes.
I think I thought that was really nice blog, actually. Yeah. And yet captured a lot of what I feel about the people I've met. I've met a lot of, not a lot, but I have met a number of adopted people through the inquiry who had lovely adoption, lovely lives, but did have this sense of kind of loss and this sense of,
And it seems as though the broader community struggles to hold those two ideas in mind, that it's either terrible or positive, and that sort of that speaks to our fairy tales and our sort of our popular myths. I was going to ask you a little question, and I don't want. We try not to be political. Actually, we don't care. I was mild.
Who for PM? Who are we going for? No, I'm joking.
Well, actually, that's what I was going to say, because
really?
I was genuinely concerned. And this is reflected on your report, because you give a really brief summary of kind of the political backdrop to some of these recent pushes and emphasis and drives. I was really concerned that Michael Gove would become Prime Minister, because I think he has a view of adoption that's not... I'm torn, because I think he's put a lot of... He pushed or started a ball rolling that put a lot of money into adoption, along with some others. But I was slow.
I admit to being so Michael Gove held a roundtable discussion many years ago before adoption became on the agenda, and I was on that roundtable.
So it's your fault.
That's my claim to fame.
Your fault.
But
very much. Sorry, I interrupted.
No, but I was thinking that what I now does not feel like a time to try and drag us back and to bolster an old system. Are you optimistic for the future? And do you see that there's a different wave, maybe with a different government, a different parliament, a different PM? Do you think that we could maybe see some of this stuff that you're talking about perhaps rise up the agenda?
Absolutely. I am optimistic. I do think when we were commissioned, when the inquiry was commissioned and we were responding, we were relating, and we say that in the article actually at the beginning, that actually things have moved on policy-wise. We were responding to the high point of a real push around adoption, weren't we, with Martin Neri and Michael Gove. I do think that has changed for all sorts of reasons, and I think there is a more nuanced understanding. I mean, you mentioned the word, Scott, permanence. I think people are talking a lot more about permanence, about doing permanence differently. There's a lot more discussion about the relationships with special guardianships, for example, all that kind of thing. I think we're in a better place, definitely. And I would think it would be hard to drag, if I talk personally about the social work profession, I think it would be hard to drag it back to where it was, where there wasn't much discussion about it, and where I think they would be a lot more kind of, no, this is not the right way to be going, to just think it's a one-size-fits-all panacea. What do you think?
I'm optimistic. I think that we're entering maybe a bit of a fallow time, but I think that in some ways, one of the questions I was going to ask you, but was in relation to, in some ways, adoption is sort of stood still and society has moved on. And I think that adoption's at a moment now where it needs to leap forwards and catch up. I was going to ask you as well, I know that I've speaking to you privately in the past, you've sort of mentioned a bit of frustration around the adoption inquiry about the response. Hoping for I don't know, I mean, you can tell me what you're hoping for, but reflecting even on that sort of a year after its release, do you think that actually it's a document that's going to perhaps endure rather than create an explosion, but a document that is going to kind of just keep going? What are your thoughts or hopes?
Look, I think change is always linked to a whole range of factors. I don't think it's just about one person or one idea. Sometimes, when you over the years, I've seen lovely pieces of research that have gone nowhere. because it wasn't the right time for them. They couldn't, for example, people who've done research years ago on young carers, for example, beautiful piece of research, but it wased the right time. But years later, and they were part of something that flowered. This, I think there's a whole range of things going on here. The voices of adopted people, the social media and their way they're using blogs. I think the voices of some adoptive parents as well. There's some really brave adoptive parents out there now trying to do contact differently, trying to engage. So I think it's as part of that, the inquiry, I think the inquiry report will be seen as something that contributed in a small way to that. I don't think it'll be, And we've had some very nice comments in that sense, people saying, look, I was struggling away with some of these issues for years, and actually since the inquiry was produced, I find there's a better conversation. For example, around contact. People are saying to me, there is a much more vibrant conversation around contact than there was 3 years ago, 4 years ago.
And I think we were talking about this, Scott, weren't we, about anything that we do in relation to contact on a podcast. We see a spike in interest. We see a spike in people engaging. We've had Professor Beth Neal on a few times, and just people are desperate for some real tangible help. Which is,
and Beth would say herself, she's been researching contact for 20 years.
Yeah.
And she's doing it for years. And I think that she would probably say there's more discussion now than there has been for a long time around it.
Yeah.
And I think, again, it comes down to that confidence thing, doesn't it? Because I think parents, as we go through, I have got no problem now with, sorry, I'll start again, because that's wrong. I haven't got the same concerns if there was contact made with my children as I would have done 13 years ago when they were first placed, because the world, yes, the world has moved on. Yes, the risks are much higher, but actually the ways of dealing with things and the information that we have and how we deal with these things has improved so much. However, and it is a big however, if I'd had the opportunity to do some things that actually we are now looking at doing back then, with confidence, I probably would have given them a damn good go, because it would have benefited my children. And I think that's the key part in this, isn't it? It's not, adoption now, we can't be sensitive. We can be sensitive. We're allowed to be sensitive in some ways, but we can't be sensitive about the needs of our children. And that's what it comes down to. If they need to still be involved with their birth parents in some way, shape, or form, and how that looks, I don't know. But I'm just saying, if it is direct, and it's a supported kind of effort that has a lot of people involved to make it work, rather than a lot of people there on the day, then why would we not consider that? It's kind of common sense in a way, but I think everybody's so fearful of it.
Yeah, and I think that when we it may be harder for you too as adoptive parents possibly to do it, but it sounds like you are doing it. But from the outside, because for years I've studied families in different forms. I've looked at divorce, because one of my areas of interest historically has been how we engage fathers and how we bring men into children's lives. And so I've done a lot of work on that over the years. And, we're talking about kind of quite complicated families where maybe the kids have different fathers and where there's all sorts going on. So I've always looked at it from more of a sociological position around how families are changing so much. And then you come to adoption and you see this very stark model, don't you, of, you change your identity, you go from one family to a brand new family with a mummy and daddy. And
complete strangers,
Yeah. And it just feels like, kids are coping with really quite complex family networks. They're coping with ex-parent, with their fathers living separately, with their father's new partner. There's lots of kids coping with quite complicated family networks and negotiating their way through it. There's a huge literature on it as well about what really helps children and what matters to them.
Well, that's really interesting, because as I was reading through it, that's the thing that came to my mind, is that actually adoption remains very conservative. And I know my children were the most normal children in their classroom in the context of blended families, separated families, in stepdads that they saw twice in a weekend, and this one coming that, and it kind of go, whoa, we seem the most settled and stable, but no one's even blinking an eye about that complexity, whereas we're ever so delicate about our complexity, or the thought of becoming complicated.
Yeah. Ooh. Well, I mean, I've got the prime example for you here. Shall I give you my little example?
Please,
just so you can
share with the group.
It backs up what you've just said, Al. It really does, because I know of a family where mum and dad aren't together. Daughter obviously has lived between mum and dad. One of them got married and had another child. Then there was issues, and they separated because of someone else who came on the scene, if you know what I'm trying to say. So basically, someone had an affair, got with somebody else, had another child, and the child from the original thing is still very much involved in this last piece of the chain that isn't actually anything to do with them. And it actually focuses more on that relationship than any of the kind of biological relationships. And that is nothing even to do with adoption. So, it's true. There's so many differing kind of setups out there, but actually for us, again, it comes down to that. Well, I think it comes down to that confidence thing of feeling able to challenge social workers, and not being educated enough to say, well, actually that might work, because the preparation for adopters is what it is. And there's nobody sitting there saying, well, challenge your social worker if you feel that this might work or that might work, because actually until you've got the child you don't know. And I get that, but before that adoption order is granted, it should be discussed again. What goes on at the placement stage isn't necessarily what's going to be right in 6 months' time.
Exactly.
I feel like I'm having a good old rant now, so apologies for that.
Your blood's up. when you Celtic types get together, it's all.
Oh, that's all.
I tell you.
Maybe I just am a fellow ranter. I don't know that you're a ranter. It seems perfectly normal to me.
I think
normal conversation.
Yes.
I think it does come down to that kind of not education. That's the wrong word to use. It just comes down to knowing that you can potentially, and the word doesn't even challenge, but just discuss it. It needs to be an open discussion to make sure that it's right for that child.
But it does ask bigger. Sorry, you're the guest.
That if the fear that if you open up issues around contact that you'll put adoptive parents off. I mean, that is a possibility, of course, a possibility. But sometimes I wonder whether there is another group of people out there who actually would be relieved to kind of think, I can have this child, I can be with this child permanently, but I don't have to pretend that I'm their mummy and daddy in that final way. I mean, this is very complicated, but I do know people who would love to make that kind of commitment to a child, but would be worried about kind of saying, actually, I am their mummy and daddy in this kind of really strict sense, who would be able to cope with the flexibility of having other birth mum and dad. I don't know. I'm not putting that across very well, but I do know people that would find that a bit freeing, actually. There are people who be terrified. There are people who want to be the one and only. Yeah.
But
and when they're told as well that these are all dangerous people, which some of them are, of course, I'm not being naive about it, but when they're told that these are all dangerous people, isn't it so much easier to say, oh, no, we can't go there.
Exactly. Yeah.
I do think that we're at a crisis. I think the crisis of adopter sufficiency, to use the technical terms.
Yeah.
I think there's literally nothing we can do to arrest that. So we might as well aim for what we want, what is best for children. And I think that we, like you said, that very first day saying that move from a position of contact might be good to contact is inevitable. Prepare for it. The first day, because it is. And I can't remember who I've seen have the same conversation over and over with different people, but I know that the first time a child gets a smartphone and you tell them they can't go out, or what you they will go to their bedroom and they will find somebody.
Yeah.
Because it takes you 20 minutes with a smartphone, and it's not a case of if, it's a case of when. So let's do it differently to meet that revealing, because the current adoption legislation wasn't even was written before Facebook.
Yeah. The
world's changed.
And in terms of, as you were saying earlier on about, why wouldn't you want to do what's best for your children as well? We do know that when they do it behind your backs, and they can be very disappointed and hurt and upset. Contact with birth family and not be able to talk about it. I mean, again, I talked to somebody in that situation who was so distraught and disappointed by what he found, and wasn't able to tell his mum, who he adored, until later. And she didn't know why he suddenly was in a terrible state. She had no idea why he was suddenly all over the place.
Yeah. You're storing up trouble, aren't you, potentially?
That was a word that was used. You were storing, young people said you're storing up trouble. Yeah, but once I don't know if you remember in the report we talked about the experience in Northern Ireland, which is very different, where the judges they never made orders. They never made can't remember what the name of the order is, but they would recommend contact, which is very odd because the social workers would then religiously go off and do it, whereas in fact it was only a recommendation, it wasn't an order. And even though the social workers didn't do it, they would go off and do this 4 to 6 times a year, and they were very unhappy with that. And we were kind of going, well, if it's not an order, then why aren't you using your discretion and working it out? But anyway, that may change in Northern Ireland, actually. I think Northern Ireland is an interesting. It's just interesting in terms of adoption anyway, because it's mostly concurrent and. I mean, we obviously through work, I know from speaking to our director in Northern Ireland, it's very different in terms of how it's done. And they have had a paper. Well, you'll know this. They've had this paper out on modernising it in inverted commas pages, and of course it's all been stalemated by the lack of an administration, but also they can't. My understanding is they can't get around the opposition to same-sex marriage. Yeah. So that's holding up. Well, I mean, at the minute there isn't an administration anyway, but it's the government. But,
but also we had because we've been doing part of the podcast is adopter and adoptee stories, just to kind of, because I think stories can be really helpful to illustrate points. And we had a New Zealander who came on and talked about the system in New Zealand, not in depth, but through her story, where there's, and obviously their culture and their context is very different with how they've interacted with Maori people, but adoption orders have contact attached as a and it almost, you have to justify why not rather than why it's a presumption of contact. Do you think that we'd ever get to a place like that in England and Wales or and Northern Ireland, depending on that?
I think some of the judiciary are wanting that, don't you? I think that they're starting to say stuff like that. I think we could do, but as long as it's not really, really prescriptive, as in you must do X amount. I think I would like the idea that you would be assuming contact would happen, or that there would be contact, but you would, and then you'd have to say, well, look, this is really going to be too dangerous, or this just couldn't happen. But you would start from an assumption that contact would be a part of it.
Which is a total flip to where we are, which is an assumption that contact will not happen. Yeah. And you have to justify it.
10 years, don't we? We're talking at least 10 years.
Yeah. But we're up for that, aren't we, Scott? We're in for the long haul.
We have no choice now, do we?
No, but I mean, I do tell people in private that I kind of set myself a goal, and then it's a long haul. But even in just telling the story, we've got lots of people telling their stories, and it makes it tangible. It's not just this scary legislation. It's about people touching families and connection, and it makes it really interesting. Well.
And often legislation, this happens in divorce as well, that legislation often comes after changes have started to happen. Legislation attempts to tidy up and to codify things that people are already doing. So we don't need to wait for legislation, and often anyway, who knows what will happen with our politics. I mean, I am optimistic in some ways, but who knows what's going to happen with our politics.
Yeah, literally.
But let's not discuss it.
No. Those are rocks we don't want to be drawn onto.
No.
Brigid,
but you know what they say, parenting isn't just till they're 18, and that's not, can I just say as well, that's not just adoptive families.
No.
Because as I've gotten older and watched some of my peers of a similar age have adult children, it really doesn't stop, you know. And I guess when you're a parent, you have these kind of I'm terrible for remembering words, but you used to have these kind of points where you would reach. What are they called?
Transition points, is it? Or?
Well, yeah, stuff like that. So, you know, you get to the age of 13, they become a teenager. Oh, yeah. Fabulous, they become a teenager. They get to 15. Oh, have they been arrested yet? No, okay. They get to 18. Oh, they're an adult now. Oh, 20, you know, stuff like that. And of course, that is important because that's all very much part of life, isn't it? You know, we all want to be 18. We all want to be 21. But we all don't want to be 40 or 40, 50 or 60 when we've still got these children who are so dependent on us. But that is the way life is. But we don't realise that when we're becoming parents, I don't think. And I think that's another conversation. But I think it's just, you know, it's the way life is for a lot of us.
A situation for children and young people in all sorts of families is very precarious now. You know, none of them are going to be able to. If you happen to live in London, they're not going to be able to afford
exactly. Yeah.
The job market's really tricky. I mean, I'm in a university, I see what's happening to young people. Very high levels of anxiety about the future, very high levels of worry about debt. Yeah. You know, it's a tricky time for a lot of them. For most of them, really, to be absolutely honest. And so, yes, I'm sure, you know, in all our families, we all have the stories of people coming back and forth and leaving and then coming back again. And, this is not just adopted families at all.
No, we're not our own kind of thingy in that. That's the thing, you know. It's not just us that have to deal with stuff like that as doctors. So, yeah, we'll leave that one there. Anyway.
Thank you, Brigid. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and we really enjoy having the difficult questions. And so you must come on again with some more difficult ones. I'll bring Anna with you because that would be good fun.
Oh wow, yeah, that'd be good. And I just got into my flow tonight as well. It was really easy to ask somebody.
You've interviewed Anna, haven't you? You've talked to her.
Yes, we did. Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, you have a great night, and thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye. No,